Welcome to the WNYDUG meetup. My name is Guy Paddock. I am the CEO and lead architect for RedBottle Design here in Rochester. And what I'm going to cover today is how to set up a continuous integration environment for Drupal with Aegir and TeamCity. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with a continuous integration environment, it's pretty much a must if you're working in a team Drupal environment. I'm sure there are people out there who will disagree with me on that one and say, well, I've been able to develop Drupal in a team environment before, and we just all share a common database and common server. Why do you say it's a must? Well, honestly, for larger projects, it is indispensable, mainly because you don't have to worry about the database as much. If you can roll everything into exportables and you can basically create an installation profile, it actually makes it that much easier if you're working with new clients to create a site for them and also to reproduce, have reproducibility with versions. So like, for example, if we do a project for a client today and we roll out that release, and then let's say we have issues with that release, but we're developing like the next version, we can go back in time and basically recreate exactly the version we rolled out and try it out and see if maybe we've corrected the issue that they're having. We can try and reproduce it in their version and see if we've corrected it in the new version. We can work with QA. If we have a QA team that's testing the site and they're identifying bugs, we're able to kind of trace it exactly to a specific build. So there's a lot of benefits of being able to have like an entire Drupal site that's just constructed from like what's currently checked in, and not have to be dependent on some variable stuff like what's in the database or what one developer might have tried out that didn't go so well. That's the other thing. That's another benefit of this setup, is that I can do a build and I can play around with some stuff. I can install a module that I might want to use for implementing a feature and then find out that it's not going to work out for me. And I don't even have to worry about like uninstalling it. I don't have to worry about like anything getting left behind in my Drupal install from that module. I can just do a new build, and it'll basically build exactly what we have checked in without that new module that I played with, and I can play around with something else and see if something else will work out. Another thing that I'll show is a lot of times when you're working with modules, you'll have patches that you need to apply. If there's an issue in the issue queue for a third-party module, I'm sure everyone watching this video has had that happen at least once, where you run across a bug in a module and it's not fixed, and someone might have a patch in the issue queue, and maybe a lot of people in the thread are arguing about the right way to solve it, but there is a patch available that you can use today. And then the question is, well, if you apply this patch, how are you going to maintain the patches? How are you going to keep track of what patches you applied? How are you going to deal with that if that patch gets accepted down the road and now you have like a new version to worry about? With the CI process, you are literally able to incorporate those patches into what's referred to as a drush makefile. And the drush makefile is almost like a recipe for your Drupal install. And so what you can do is you can grab that patch if it solves your problem today, roll it into your install, and then down the road, if you're doing a new release for that site, or if you're doing updates, you can always use the CI process to do a new build and take that patch out if like they have a better way of doing it upstream. So these are all some of the benefits that you get from a CI process. What I'll do is I'll cover how you get it all set up with Ubuntu Server, Aegir, and TeamCity. TeamCity, by the way, is a continuous integration server from JetBrains. So a lot of tutorials out there on Drupal CI. Drupal CI will usually say you should use something like Hudson or Jenkins. We chose TeamCity because from a user friendliness perspective, we found it to be a lot more usable. And the other benefit is that it's free up to, I think, like 10 build configurations and 2 build agents. So for small teams, it's ideal because you can get set up with it pretty quickly and it's free. And then if you're on a larger project, you can always upgrade the license. But we just found it to be really, really useful in this kind of workflow. Plus, we do some projects that are beyond Drupal, and so it's nice that it can build some like .NET projects on some build agents and Drupal projects on other ones. So anyway, enough talking. Let's get into how we actually do this here. So I'm going to go ahead and install Ubuntu Server. And we have a Hyper-V server that's running our VMs. It doesn't have to be Hyper-V. You can do this on any VM server. You could do it on physical hardware. So it's not really important that it's a VM server, but that's what we're using is Hyper-V, and I'll go ahead and install Ubuntu Server on this here. And there's not a heck of a lot we have to do special with the Ubuntu installation. I'm just going to install a LAMP stack, so Apache, MySQL, PHP, normal stuff for running Drupal. The fun part of picking keyboard layout. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out is for the Aegir installation, that's primarily why we chose Ubuntu Server for this. I know in the hosting community, CentOS tends to be a popular choice, or Red Hat. It's just the fact that Aegir has a pretty nice installation path. If you're on Ubuntu or a Debian-based system, they have the packages already all built, and it'll configure Apache for exactly the way you need it to work for Aegir to work. So for any of you out there who might have tried to install a previous version of Aegir yourselves, there's usually a lot of steps involved because you have to kind of customize the way that Apache is set up, and there's a lot of margin for error if you miss a step. And we found that the packages for Ubuntu make it really easy. So that's why we're using it for this. We tend to use CentOS for a lot of other things, but all right, let's name this Aegir demo 2.redbottledesign.com. I'll create an account for myself. Now, I'm blowing through these steps pretty quickly because this isn't really special for what we're doing. I'm just doing a normal Ubuntu install and accepting the defaults for pretty much everything. I will have some steps where it's specific to what we're doing, and so I'll call those out. Right now, though, it's just doing the normal thing of partitioning the disk and getting that all set up. And I'm just telling it to use the full disk. So nothing really terribly special about that. Let's see, other things that would be useful to know. Okay, so right now it's just installing the base Ubuntu system. I'll get a prompt in a little bit that'll ask me if I want like LAMP, so what I was mentioning before of Apache, MySQL, PHP, and then of course I'll also be asking for SSH because we want a way to be able to connect to this after it launches. You know, other than through the console here in Hyper-V, you know, we'll want to be able to log into it remotely. So that's getting spun up here. I was actually surprised how quickly Ubuntu installs. It seems like, you know, everything nowadays takes only a matter of minutes. I remember back in the day it used to take like an hour or two to install like Debian. And even Microsoft now with like Windows, you know, you can install like Windows 8 in like 10 minutes. I'm like, how did they do this? But data's getting faster. So right now it's just installing the kernel, and then it'll give me the prompt so I can pick what I want to do with this server. Now I also wanted to point out this setup will work for Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 sites. For Drupal 8, I believe there's a patch that needs to be applied to Aegir to support the newer version. I think it's a patch to support the newest version of DRush, which is the Drupal shell, the command line tool for managing Drupal sites, so it can support Drupal 8. So just as a disclaimer, if you're going to try and run Drupal 8 on this, you'll probably need some additional steps. We haven't done a lot of new development on Drupal 8 just yet because A lot of our customers aren't ready to take the dive yet with it still being in beta. But I'm sure that as soon as we do, we'll be updating our process and we'll add some steps and we can put them out on our blog so people know if they're following along with what we're doing here. So this will take a moment here. Now, did you have any questions while I'm waiting on this?
No, you've covered just about everything.
Okay. This is the part in the video where we'll speed it up and there'll be a clock in the background that's like running double time. Come on, finish installing the kernel so that I can select what I want. %, and one of the other things we were noticing with Ubuntu Server over something like CentOS on a VM is that it seems like they have better support for whatever virtualization environment you're using. So like in our case, we're using Hyper-V, and surprisingly, Ubuntu has better driver support for Microsoft Hyper-V than CentOS and Red Hat do. With Red Hat, we have to do a lot of post-installation steps to get networking to work correctly. So that was another nice thing about it. And Ubuntu Server is actually a pretty nice interface, even though I know a lot of times people think Ubuntu is just like the consumer-friendly version of Linux. The server version is actually pretty nice if you haven't used it yourself. So, okay. So I should get a prompt. Come on. Retrieving file. Oh, okay. We're installing the base level system. Okay.
Have you ever tried this with Nginx for any reason?
Oh, like getting the setup for with Aegir on Nginx? I have not. I've read a lot about it, and performance-wise, I hear it's much better. Because I mean, the downside with the way that Apache normally sets up the server, you know, you have a lot of overhead because you're invoking all that on every request, and so even like images have the same cost to handle the request as PHP does, whereas like Nginx, it can serve up small files pretty quickly. But there is a module that ships with Aegir that has Nginx support, so you can enable that. And I would actually be curious to see if someone is experimenting with that. I'd be curious to see how that works. Okay, so this is the prompt I was looking for and I was waiting for, and now it's come up. What I'm going to do here, this is where we get to pick what software we want on the machine. So I'm going to pick LAMP server, and I'm also going to pick OpenSSH server, that way I can use SSH to log into the server after it's done installing. So we'll go ahead and we'll run that. Most of these packages are already on the CD image for Ubuntu. Okay, and it's also going to ask me what password I want for MySQL. This is an important step because you have to remember what this password is when Aegir needs it later. For the purposes of this install and for this demo, I'm going to use ABC123 as my password for everything because this is a developer machine. and it's only for internal consumption. Do not use ABC123 if the server is publicly accessible, unless you like to be hacked by random, attackers from Russia or China, or you take your pick. There's a lot of automated scripts out there. So, all right, so ABC123, we'll use that for now. Do as I say, not as I do, as it comes to passwords. But when you have an internal machine like this and you have multiple developers who occasionally need to look at the database, it's nice if it's a known password. But don't ever use it for production, because that's just a bad idea. Okay, so this is installing all the stuff I just told it to. So it's installing PHP 5, it's installing MySQL, it's installing Apache, and then it's also installing OpenSSH. So somehow, for some reason unbeknownst to me, this actually takes less time than installing the kernel. And you'd think that the kernel's like 10 files, but there's also all the supporting stuff for kernel drivers, so I guess it makes sense. But this stuff tends to go by pretty quickly. Let's see, do we know what the IP address of this is? No, not yet. Okay. Actually, we might. What's this say? No, not yet. Okay. As soon as I know what the IP address of this is, I'll register the server in DNS, so that way we can actually connect to the sites that we'll be hosting on Aegir. But I have to wait until this is done installing to find that out. Now, MySQL is not the only option you have as far as the database goes. A lot of people have switched over to MariaDB for various reasons, not the least of which is just not wanting to have to deal with Oracle licensing. Not that you have to pay for MySQL or anything, it's just Oracle has tended to be kind of annoying when it comes to the MySQL license, and there's some features that they were dragging their feet with that MariaDB supports when you're doing larger deployments, when you need to do a lot of things like replication and advanced failover and that sort of thing. We don't tend to need that for our Aegir environment, but if you're on a very large CI environment, like if you have a lot of developers on your team, you'll probably need to scale that up to be able to deal with all of the builds going on. But for us, we're a smaller company, so we don't have as many CI builds going on at the same time. So that would be overkill if we had like multiple MySQL servers for CI. Okay, 85%. The Ubuntu Foundation should sell ad space during the install. Be like, there we go. Your ad here. Cleaning up, okay. So momentarily it should ask me if I want to restart. Okay, and oh, you're thinking about it. I know you're thinking about it. course, we need the bootloader. How else are we going to boot into the system? Forgot. That's the all-important step before you reboot. Okay, so of course this VM is only used for Aegir. It's only going to be used for the continuous integration environment, so we have no other operating systems on this machine. So I'm of course going to say yes, it's perfectly fine for you to install the Linux bootloader grub. So I'll do that. Okay, finishing the installation, setting users and passwords, updating that. Installation complete. Please remove CD. Cool. All right. That's doing its final steps. Cool. Okay, so now the VM is restarting. So far, so good. Cool. All right, so we have our VM. I'm gonna go ahead and log in. Okay. And first thing I want to do before I do anything else is I want to get this set up in DNS so that later steps are easy for us to perform. So we will be able to pull up things in a web browser and whatnot. So my IP address here is 192.168.100.127. So what I'll do is I'll quickly log into my domain controller here. Now this will depend on however you have DNS set up. You know, if you have DNS through a third party or you have, you know, some other system managing DNS, however you register in DNS, just make sure that you do. And one of the things I'll mention is, or one other thing I'll mention while I'm doing this is that you'll want to use a wildcard rule for your CI environment. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. Let me just go ahead and create this DNS zone for this machine here. I said 127. Okay, so we're going to call this Aegir demo2.redbottledesign.com. This is our internal DNS server, so this isn't like world accessible. This only works here in our office. And what I'm going to do is two things. So I'm going to create two different A records. One is an A record that is the root record. So this is the one for this specific, you know, VM. So if I were to type in Aegir-demo2.redbottledesign.com, this is the record that would handle that. And I'm going to make that the IP address that I grabbed. So the 192.168.100. I said 127, I believe. Let me just double check. 127, right. So I'll make that this one. The other record I'm going to add is a wildcard record. So this one's going to be star.aegir-demo2.redbottledesign.com. The reason for the wildcard record is that as the builds go out, they're going to be named automatically based on the build number for whatever build we're doing, and actually even based on the project that's being built. And so the wildcard rule here allows us to support all those builds without anyone actually having to go in and add a record for every build. You know, there's no manual step involved in updating DNS. It's just anything that ends in Aegir-demo2.redbottledesign.com is going to go to this IP, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so those are all set up. So I'm done with DNS. I should be all set with DNS. Now, next thing we're going to want to do, let me pull up my notes here. So I'm going to want to install, I'm going to want to add the Aegir repository to what the package installer for Ubuntu knows about. There is a link, I can provide this, when we post the video, I'll post all the links attached to the video, but there's a page in the documentation for Aegir that gives you the commands to do this. So I'll just copy those in. We're basically just adding the Ubuntu repo that they provide. So that's less than helpful. Actually, you know what I'll do? I'll switch over to SSH. So now this is why SSH was really important. I'm going to log in to my new VM over my SSH client. And I'll log in as me. Okay, there we go. I'll just copy this from my notes here.
We're going to zoom in a little bit so they can see.
Okay. Yeah, I can also make this probably larger if that's helpful. Let me make my window appearance, change this to 20 point. That'd be large enough. That might be too large, but we'll see. Well, let me resize this window there. Okay. So what we did was we just added the Aegir projects repo to dpackage and apt. And so now what I can do, let me do an update of the packages that the apt knows about, apt being Ubuntu's package manager. So it's doing that update. Oh, I have to I have to make sure I add the key for the Aegir project to the trusted key list. Otherwise you'll get an error that it doesn't trust the keys. Because the releases from them are digitally signed to make sure that no one is messing with them in transit. Okay. Alright, so now that's happy. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'll install Aegir. Now, this is an important step, and I actually made a mistake with this in the past that took a while to sort out. When you're installing Aegir, there are actually two different versions you can install from that repo. There's Aegir 1 and Aegir 2. And the package name for Aegir 1 is just Aegir. So it's very easy for you to just accidentally type apt get install Aegir, and you'll get the wrong version. And that version is not as friendly. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do sudo apt-get install Aegir 2. And it'll say, okay, we need to install all these different things. drush make, Drupal 7, a whole bunch of stuff for PHP, and all these dependent modules. And that's great. We want it to do all that stuff for us because normally we would be installing all these packages by hand and configuring all of them, and no one wants to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and you want to move this way? Okay. There we go. All right. And what this is having me do is it wants to know what we want to do is do for the mail server configuration. I actually do have to drop the font down to be able to interact with this dialog because they didn't anticipate that I'd have it quite so large. Let's see. Okay, so it wants to know how mail should be handled on this server. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is a CI environment, so why do I care about mail? Well, if you're going to be testing any features that use mail, you definitely want mail to work. And also, if you ever forget a password on one of the CI instances, you'll want mail to work. So you should be fine with internet site. That'll work fine. And then it'll ask you what you want the mail name to be. This is just the name of the server as you want it to appear in email. So I'm just going to go with the default here, which defaults to the name of the server. You get another question that asks you, what do you want the URL to be for Aegir? There is a thing called Hostmaster. It's the front end to Aegir. It allows you to manage your Drupal sites, do everything from copy them to back them up to reset passwords, things like that. This is asking what you want the URL to be. The default should be fine. It's the same name as the server itself. This is why we wanted to set up that record earlier, the non-wildcard record, because that should match what we enter here. So in this case, I'm just going to make it aegirdemo2.redbottledesign.com. This is the step I was mentioning earlier. It's going to ask you, what is the password for the MySQL server? And it needs to be the root password because Aegir provisions databases for these Drupal sites. And it needs to have unlimited ability to do that. You could technically create another user account that has the same privileges as root, but with this being a development server and not a production server, it should be fine to use the root account. So we're just going to go with the ABC123 password I had from before. And we're off. Now what's going to happen is it's basically setting up all those packages. I'm just going to knock the font size up again so that we can see what's going on camera. So it's finishing the installation. It's installing all those other packages that were needed for Aegir to work correctly. Now there is one step in this that I do expect to fail, and I have a workaround for it. For some reason, the version of the packages that's out there now has one variable that needs to be tweaked for the latest version of Ubuntu. So it will fail probably on the step that's happening right now. Let's see. No, not yet. Right after it installs, I think, Hostmaster, there's an error in the config that it generates that causes the latest version of Apache to be upset. Oh, this is where it's installing Hostmaster, and it wants the password again for MySQL, so ABC123 in this case. It's installing the front end, and after this, I think, is the error that I'm expecting to see. This installer is not quite as exciting as the Ubuntu installer, but gets the point across. But at least it does in several minutes what it used to take hours and hours of trial and error following the manual for Aegir in the past. So what this is doing in the background is it's actually using Aegir to install Aegir, if you can believe it. Drush, the Drupal shell, is what Aegir uses under the hood for all the things it does with the Drupal sites. And so what it's doing is it's actually using the same commands that it uses when you use the front end to create a new Drupal site to set up Hostmaster, which is the front end for Aegir. And so it's doing everything from creating the database for the Hostmaster front end to setting up the files there to creating that settings.php file that everyone knows from setting up Drupal by hand. So it's generating all that stuff and putting it in the right spot, setting up the database, getting that all configured and ready to be used. So it's all happening in the background. Okay, and it gives you a link to be able to log into the Aegir front end, but don't log in yet until all of these steps are done because it's not quite finished yet. Wow, actually, I did not need a workaround this time. That's awesome. Usually there's a workaround I need to install, but it might have corrected that. Okay, so now I can use this link. Let's give that a shot and see what we get. Of course, I resized my browser window, or my shell window, so maybe I need to fix the formatting on that. Okay. So let's see if we can log into our new setup here. We can, okay. So I'm logged into Hostmaster, which is the Aegir front end. And for anyone who has done the manual steps to install Aegir, you can now appreciate why the Ubuntu packages are awesome. So I'm all set here. I'm in Hostmaster, and as you can see, one of the things that was just completed in the Aegir queue was this creation of this Aegir demo2.redbottledesign.com site, and that is Hostmaster. So, like I said, Aegir installed Aegir. That's what we want to see. Okay, so that's all set. What I'll do now is we need to get, let's see, we need to get TeamCity installed. So TeamCity is the continuous integration server I mentioned earlier. That's what's actually going to push jobs through Aegir. So it's going to be the system responsible for realizing when we check in code that there needs to be a Drupal site built, and it actually orchestrates the process of grabbing those changes and then telling Aegir we need a new Drupal site and telling it what to do. So first thing we need to do for TeamCity is we need to install Java. because TeamCity runs on Java. So I'll go ahead and do sudo apt-get install default JRE. It'll probably install something like OpenJRE, which is the Open Java runtime. So this will take a few minutes because it has to grab a decent number of packages. But you don't necessarily have to run, in fact, you probably should not run TeamCity on the same server with Aegir. In this case, I'm doing it just for convenience for this setup. For our environment here at RedBottle, we actually have a separate Windows server that's running TeamCity because we do a combination of Drupal and .NET builds, and so we're able to basically have the Windows server run TeamCity and also do our .NET builds for us. But you can install TeamCity on a separate server, and that server doesn't need Aegir. It doesn't actually need anything related to Drupal. The important thing is that you need at least one TeamCity agent running on a Linux server that is running Aegir, and that is what will handle your Drupal builds. And later on, I'll show you how we actually tell TeamCity which servers it can and can't run these Drupal installs on. There's actually some criteria we can add to say, okay, like, this is a Drupal build, so you can't just run it on any server, it has to be one that has Aegir on it. Okay, so this is getting Java all set up for us. And unpacking all that, this is Java 7. Not really much to say about that. Now, if for some reason you guys do have a problem with installing the packages for Aegir, if it errors out, if you get an error on the installation of the packages and the error is something along the lines of like an Apache configuration error, there is a workaround for that. That's what I was mentioning earlier, and I can post the link to that in the comments on this video in case you run into it. I've run into it like 2 out of the 3 times that I've installed the packages. So I don't know whether it's just sporadic that it happens or if maybe they've updated the packages since the last time I ran it, but it's an easy workaround. There's just one file that needs updating. Okay, so it's installing all of the trusted certificates for Java to be happy. All right, so now I'm back here at the prompt, and what I'm going to do is install I'm going to create an account for TeamCity to run under. On Linux, TeamCity provides, or JetBrains provides the TeamCity package, literally just a gzip to tar archive, and they kind of leave it up to you to install it. They don't really have an installer for it. On Windows, they have like an MSI installer that kind of sets everything up. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new TeamCity user, and I'm going to set the home folder there to /opt/TeamCity. I'm going to tell it to create the home folder for us, and I'm also going to set the shell to bash because I'm going to be logging in as that user for a little bit. Okay, and one other thing I want to do, let's see, I want to make the TeamCity user part of the Aegir group. The reason is because ironically, it's not needed for the build, but it will be needed at the end of the build when we want to grab the build artifacts. It needs to basically capture what Aegir is going to create for us so that we have like a snapshot of what the build looked like. So I'm going to actually modify this TeamCity user, and I'm going to put them in the Aegir and WW data groups. So for those of you who have not used usermod before, you're able to basically tell it what groups by name if you use capital G. So I'm giving it capital G, Aegir, and comma WW data, so those 2 groups. And I'm also giving it -A for append, as in we don't want it to replace the list of groups that the TeamCity user is in. We just want to supplement them. But, of course, I need to run that with sudo. Okay, now if I ask the system what groups TeamCity's in, it says WW data and Aegir, which is what we want. Okay, so now we have our TeamCity user. I can go ahead and download the TeamCity package. So if you go to the JetBrains website, actually if I just do a search for TeamCity, if you go to the TeamCity website, they will give you the different options for installing it in Windows and Mac OS 10 and whatnot. Of course, you just want the one for Linux. So I can go to this download link up here in the upper right, or the big download link on the home page, and I'll pick Linux, and then if I click this link, it'll actually send me right to the download page, and it'll give me the archive. I actually grabbed the link earlier, so I'll just use the link I have. But they mentioned it's a professional server license, and you can use it on up to 3 build agents, actually, with a maximum of 20 build configurations. So for small teams, small to medium-sized teams, that's actually not bad. You could technically install it on multiple separate Aegir servers, too. It's just that it's usually easier if you have a larger team to buy the enterprise license. But we'll go ahead and use the professional one for now, and I'm going to use wget and download this archive here, TeamCity. This will take a minute or two. Actually, apparently that 4 minutes. This part I wish was a little bit faster, but it is a decent size archive. It's 563 megs, so not a small install. It's probably about the same size as all of the packages I've just installed, so it's a little bit on the larger side. But let's see, other things to mention. Yeah, nothing mentioned just yet. One of the other things we're going to be doing with this TeamCity account that I created is I'm going to set a password on it. And the reason I'm going to do that is TeamCity actually supports an option called agent push. So remember how I mentioned that the TeamCity server doesn't actually have to be on Linux or on a server with Aegir. You can actually have TeamCity deploy the build agent that you're using, which actually runs the real job through Aegir. You can use the web interface for TeamCity to push that out. And if you know what the username and password are on the target system, you can supply that in the web interface. And we'll actually be doing that. And with luck, that will deploy the way I want it to. Every so often, I have to fix the configuration, but hopefully that'll work for us. And that actually gets pretty much everything you need for the build agent setup. It'll set it up with the right version. It'll make sure that that build agent is pointing back to our TeamCity install, so we don't have to worry about configuring any of that stuff. And then the only thing that we'll have to do once that gets pushed out is we have to configure the agent to start with the server. So there's like an init script we have to drop into place, and we would want to register that with the system startup scripts or system startup manager so that it actually starts those on boot. That way, if you restart the VM, you're not wondering why your builds aren't running. So, just wait on this for a few minutes here. Let's see. One of the other nice things about the setup here is that you can use pretty much any version control, any major version control system that you want to use with this deployment setup. So we use Mercurial. If you're doing Drupal development, you're most likely using Git, because years ago they had that great Git migration from CVS over. TeamCity supports like CVS and Subversion and Perforce and Mercurial and Git and whatnot. And the way that it does the actual source control is that's handled through the TeamCity server. So it doesn't actually, you don't actually technically need to install source control on each of your build agents. It just has to be installed on the top level server. because what it'll do is that server is the part that's talking to source control. So every time that you commit something or there's a change or something that would kick off a build, that's the component that's actually listening to source control, and it'll build a patch from what changed. So whatever you committed, the top level server actually creates a patch, and it's the patch that it sends down to the build agent. So it's not sending the entire repository down every time that you're doing a build. You can definitely tell it to do that if you want. You can tell it to do a clean build every time, but it's a lot more time consuming if you're having it do a full build or full download of the files every time. So what we'll be doing here is I'm going to be configuring it for Mercurial, because I'll be using an installation profile or a DRush makefile that we have internally here. And let's see, that project, I'll give you guys a tour of that in a few minutes. It's pretty simple installation profile, like skeleton, that we use as the basis for a lot of our projects. So whenever we start a new project, we copy a certain set of files. Actually, you know what? I can give that to her now since we're waiting on this download. I have this sample installation profile, and this is just IntelliJ, the IntelliJ editor. And I can, if you want, I can actually provide the files to this if you guys wanted it as a skeleton. But for those of you who haven't worked with installation profiles before, an installation profile usually consists of several makefiles, DRush makefiles. And I mentioned earlier they're like recipes for your site. So you'll usually have one top level one, and I'll see if I can make this a little bit larger so it's easier to see on camera. Let's see, fonts, colors and fonts. We'll make this. We'll make this 24 or, yeah, 24 should be all right for now, I think. Okay, so in this case I have a file called build-sample.make. This is my sample installation profile. This is the top level DRush makefile. And what this does is it includes another makefile that specifies what version of Drupal core we want. So this Drupal org core.make file is pretty short. It just says we want version 7x, and specifically we want 7.3.5, which is, as of this video, the current version of Drupal 7. And I have a couple patches here that I always apply to Drupal, mostly to deal with like limitations with the shortcut bar. We like a lot of shortcuts, and there's a limit normally of like 7 or so. So anyway, long story short, we can patch core in this file, and then the top level file that I was mentioning earlier, this build-sample.make, has a reference to our installation profile itself. What this build-sample.make file is supposed to do, this top level make file, is it's supposed to basically tell DRush make how to get the rest of the installation profile. So the idea is if you were to give someone this top level make file and that Drupal org core make file, and just those two files, this should be enough information to get DRush make to build the rest of the platform, the rest of the installation profile for you. Download all the modules, get everything set up. In our case, we are actually checking this file in with a lot of the rest of the installation profile. So we actually package this with the file it's referring to. But if you download a top level make file from Drupal.org for one of the major distributions like CVCRM or OpenPublish or one of those, you'll see that the way they set it up is they have the name of the project here, and it's a profile, and they indicate which version it is, and that kind of tells DRush make like what version to download from Drupal.org. And then the download type will usually be like either like HTTP or it'll be Git or something like that, and the source will be the URL to that profile. And so you would basically run DRush make with this make file, and then it would go out to Drupal.org and it would download the rest of the profile and follow the instructions in whatever it downloads, and download the rest of the profile. In our case, we're using a plugin for DRush, and I'll be installing this in a little bit on the server. It's a plugin called DRush Make Local, and what that allows us to do is actually refer to files that are in the local folder around our DRush Make file. So that allows us to kind of package a couple of these pieces together. It actually ends up being important for this CI setup because it used to be the case when we first set this up that these paths we were using were like Git paths. And the problem with that is that then when we would do a build, and the CI build would try to run this makefile through Aegir, and I'll show you how all this works in a minute, but when it would go to run the build, it would end up doing another checkout of whatever the latest code was from our source control server to go get the rest of the profile. And the problem with that is you can't reproduce builds, because it would always be grabbing the latest code rather than the code that should be the code that matches what that build is doing. So the idea is, like, let's say that I do some changes to my code and I commit them and it causes a build to kick off, and then say someone else commits more code or pushes more code up to the server in between my changes that started the build and the point in the build where it actually gets the changes. It might grab someone else's changes, and then that could cause a build failure if maybe what they committed didn't work. And then we'd spend time trying to figure out, like, well, wait, was it my changes or their changes, or what actually got included in this? By using drush make local, we're able to have TeamCity handle getting all the files we want in that build gathered up and then sent down to the build agent all in one package. And then drush make just uses those files. So that's how this top level file is structured. And then the file that this is referring to that actually builds the rest of the installation profile is this Drupal-org.make. The naming of these files is a little bit counterintuitive. I unfortunately am not in charge of the naming there. The community has a standard for how they're supposed to be named, but this Drupal-org.make file is the one that actually defines all of the modules that are in the installation profile. So these are all the third-party modules that we're grabbing from Drupal.org, along with specifically like what versions we want. So in this case, like, you know, we have certain modules we use for content, like migrate, and we have some things for, you know, UUIDs, universally unique identifiers for content, things like that. Some things to help out with development. So basically, this is the recipe for our installation profile. Any case where in Drupal development you would normally be downloading a module and putting on your dev site, in this process, you'd actually add to this makefile a set of lines to describe which module you need and what version you need. The benefit of that is that if you need to upgrade modules down the road, because new versions will inevitably come out, it's actually a matter of just opening this file and changing what version you're pulling down and then doing a new build. And you'll actually get whatever the newest version, or whatever version you specified, that's what's in that new build. And the CI server will help you verify whether the installation is successful or not with the new version. That will help, because then, you know, you're not just doing an upgrade on a production site. You can test it out in a build. The other nice thing that I mentioned earlier is you can apply patches. So in this case, like, I have a patch here that I applied to the date module to fix some incompatibilities with migrate. You know, there's some issues where, like, dates aren't handled properly with migrations. So I can add those patches right here in this drush make file, and then in the build, drush will automatically handle patching the modules. And it'll actually generate a file in the modules folder called patches.txt that keeps track of what patches were applied. So in production, if I am doing a module upgrade outside of this process, at least I know, okay, this module has some patches applied, and here's what they were. But yeah, anyone who's ever had to deal with, like, maintaining patches, this is nice because you don't have to really worry about how to apply them, and you don't have to keep track of, like, what you downloaded. It's all here in this drush make, this recipe for your installation profile. So that's how that all works as far as the structure goes. And then the other files we have in here, you might recognize the structure. It's very similar to what you'd see under, like, sites all or sites, whatever your site folder is, except this is the installation profile. So we have a folder called modules in our installation profile, and the layout of this modules folder is left up to your discretion as to how you want to organize it. The way we organize it is we have a folder under modules called custom. If we have any, like, custom modules that we're writing specifically for this installation profile, we can check them in that folder, and Drupal will see them. If we're exporting features, which inevitably we will be, so we're using the features module to export those. Those go under a folder called features under modules. And our skeleton here, our skeleton installation profile, has usually at least one feature called the name of the profile _devel. This is a feature we have that just has some developer-friendly enhancements for the installation profile. So it does certain things, like it adds shortcuts that we commonly need in development for things like performance and whatnot at the top. And then it also does some extra configuration of the site. So it'll set the name of the site to include the build number in the site name, so when we're looking it up in the browser window, we know what build number it is, and other things like that. You can create your own development module or development feature that has those niceties or whatever you need it to do, so that basically those things that as a developer you might have to go in and configure every time you do a build, you can roll that in here and save yourself some time. But anyway, the layout of our modules folder is that way. So we have this custom, we have features. Occasionally we'll have like a content folder. I'll cover that later. And then what happens during the installation process is drush make will actually add extra folders under modules. There's actually another folder that gets created in our process called contrib. And drush actually is accustomed to working with that folder. If you actually do follow this convention and create a folder called contrib under modules, and then you use drush to install modules, it'll actually look for that folder and put modules in there by default. But in our make file, in our drush org make, you might have noticed I have this subdir directive for a lot of these that says put it in the contrib folder. And that's just kind of how we keep the modules separate. So we know which ones we put there, which ones we got from Drupal.org, and so on. So that's the general structure of the modules folder. And then, of course, there's another folder called themes. You can put the themes that go with your installation profile in here. So for customer sites, we'll usually have under our themes custom folder one or more themes that's specific to that client's project. And it'll usually be a sub-theme that's based on something like Omega or one of the other base themes. And the theme, the base theme, you can throw in your drush or your Drupal org make file. So I can actually tell drush to go download Omega or whatever my base theme is and not have to worry about fetching it. I can just put my sub-theme here under themes custom. So that is pretty much the layout there. And then, as is usually the case with installation profiles, you have like an info file, like everything in Drupal. You have your info file that describes to Drupal that this is a distribution or a installation profile, and then you have like your .install file that has all your logic for doing the install. You can rip open any of Drupal's like standard install profile or the minimal to see what goes into these. I'm not going to get into too much detail here. I can provide the sample code, but basically there's certain things in here that tell Drupal how to install itself. So everything from setting up user roles, the default set of user roles, to any default settings and things like that, user pictures, all that stuff. So that's all in here. And then you have, so there's the .install, which only runs during installation, then the .profile, which has like utility functions and things like that are part of the profile, and some hooks and things like that. Oh, one thing I will mention while I'm here actually. There is a nifty module. It's not really a module, it's more like a library called Profiler. If you happen to be building an installation profile, this is something we recently started using for ours. Profiler is really handy because it allows you to do a lot of stuff that you used to have to write code for in your info file for your installation profile. So Profiler will actually allow you to declare, for example, blocks. If there's blocks that you need to configure as part of installing your site, you can do that in the info file. And this is a little bit of shameless self-promotion. There are probably 2 or 3 issues in the issue queue for Profiler that have patches from me to allow it to work with third-party blocks from other modules and a couple other things there. But anyway, with Profiler, you can move a lot of what you would normally have to write custom code for in your installation profile into your info file. So that's handy, and it does a few other nice things for you during the install. Like you can tell it what theme you want it to default. You can set up some of your variables to be defaulted the way you want, and it's just as easy as adding it to the info file instead of tearing your hair out for like 2 hours when you write code to do it during install and it just doesn't work. Sometimes, like during install, certain things in the Drupal API do not work the way that you expect they will work because Drupal's not finished installing yet. So some of those things just aren't ready. Profiler already kind of deals with all that and knows what works and what doesn't. So a lot of the things that you would normally do manually, you can do in your info file. So I wanted to call that out. The other thing I want to mention, one of the patches I have out there for Profiler adds a hook post install, a hook site post install. If you've worked with installation profiles and you've worked with features before, you know that occasionally features do not install quite right during site installation. There's certain things that just for some reason you need to do it like after everything else is installed, or you need to like, do like a features revert or something like that. The patch for Profiler allows your features to be invoked in a special hook called like hook site post install. So you can do certain tasks that you would only ever do if that feature was running at site install. But I think that'll end my self-promotion on that, but I just wanted to mention it because it does come in handy. Okay, so by now, we should have TeamCity downloaded, and we do. So let's finish the TeamCity install, shall we? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a folder here called TeamCity, and I'm going to move the gzipped file that I downloaded there. And what we'll do is we'll unzip that, standard stuff. This is when you find out why the archive is 535 megs. They have a lot of different runners for all of the different kinds of things that you can build with TeamCity and all the different source control systems it can handle. So it'll unpack all that. Let's see, anything else I can be covering while that's running? Not really, that pretty much rounded out the installation profile structure. Okay, so we got that. What I'm going to do is I'll move the TeamCity folder that I got from this archive into the home folder for TeamCity that I set up earlier. And the other thing I'm going to do, I had mentioned I was going to do this earlier, I'm going to set a password for the TeamCity user. And of course, I am being bad and making it ABC123 for the moment because it's a demo, and again, don't do this in production. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch over to the TeamCity user. Actually, before I do that, I want to make the files that I just moved owned by TeamCity. So we'll switch the ownership there. Okay, now I can switch over to being the TeamCity user. Okay, and we'll go here, and we'll go into bin. Okay, so I am currently in the opt TeamCity bin folder, and I can go ahead and run a script in here called TeamCity server.sh and tell it to start the server. And what this will do is it'll start an instance of Tomcat running the TeamCity server. One thing I'm not covering here is how you get this server running at startup, because in our case, like I said, we run it on Windows and the installer already has it run as part of the server. What you'd want to do is there's instructions on the TeamCity wiki or TeamCity documentation for how to get the TeamCity server running at startup. You'll just need to follow that, but basically what it does is it kicks off this shell script, and you can actually deploy this on a larger scale Java application server if you want to, but it ships with Tomcat, which works out pretty well for small to medium-sized deployments. Okay, so now the server should be running, but this is going to be the first time that I've logged into it. So I'm going to go to aegir-demo2.redbottledesign.com. Now the default port, I believe, is 8111. They chose that port because, as you might know, on a Linux system, ports over, I think it's over, I'm trying to remember there's a certain number that it has to be over that non-admin, non-root users can run as. I think, isn't it over like 1,000, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, there's some number that it allows users like the TeamCity user to run a server at. So that's the default port. There's a way to change that, but it's in the documentation. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll configure this, and it's going to ask me on the first run how I wanted this set up. What database do I want to use? You can use the internal database, the internal HSQLDB, and that should work fine. As your deployment gets larger, as you have more users using it, you might want to switch to something else like MySQL or Microsoft SQL or one of the others, but for now I'll just use the internal one because that seems to work fine for our needs. going to go ahead and create that database for us and initialize TeamCity. Okay, this is initializing TeamCity for the first time. This only happens the first time you run it. So after this is done, the next time you start TeamCity or the next time you're logging into it, you'll see what I'll see right after this, which is where you get to see the builds and administer them and things like that. But they have a nice little first run wizard here. Takes care of this stuff. Of course, the mandatory license agreement, which I will speed read and continue. Okay, and it's going to have me create an administrator account. There is a way to reset this if you forget it, but it involves running some commands from the command line to do it. So I would recommend whatever user account you create here, remember that credentials, but you won't need it during the rest of this install, as long as you remain logged in. So I'll just set it to what I want it to be. Okay, what's loading right now is the normal, or the standard TeamCity interface. So this is the part that's actually fairly user-friendly. It's actually very nice. We've been pretty happy with it. So I have no projects configured, and I have no build agents. And for a continuous integration server, that's kind of a problem, because we need to be able to build things. I also don't have source control set up yet, so I want to fix that too. So let's take care of source control first, and then we'll take care of getting the agent installed. So I'm going to install Mercurial. Now, I wanted to point out again, I'm not installing Mercurial on the TeamCity server. I'm installing it on where I'm going to be running the build agent. It just so happens that in this setup example, it's all on the same machine. But you'll want to install, actually no, I do actually want to install source control on the server that's running TeamCity. I misspoke there. You want source control to be on the TeamCity server, not the build agent. You can have it on the build agent, but it's not required to be on the build agent, because the top level server is what actually does the communication with source control, like I had mentioned earlier. So let's go ahead and switch back to a user who can install things, and we will install Mercurial. I should also install Git, but I am fairly certain Ubuntu automatically installed Git, because most users want Git on a Linux machine. But I'll install both of them together. Yep, Git is already installed and already the latest version. So we'll go ahead and install Mercurial. For those of you following along at home, you might not need Mercurial unless you're using Mercurial in your environment. We just happen to be using it here, so that's why I'm installing it. Okay, so this should not take very long. This is just a few packages to install. And then we're going to want to install the TeamCity agent, which is the actual part that does the building. So as soon as this is done, I will do that. Actually, I can show you where that is. So there's two modes with TeamCity, depending on whether you're in the administrative area or not, and whether you're an administrative user or not. If you're just a regular user, you'll see this kind of interface, and it breaks it down by projects and changes and agents and all that. If you're an admin, you'll also have this extra link called administration. If you go to administration, that's where you actually can do things like create projects, set up build agents, all that type of stuff. What we're going to do is we're going to go to, let's see, actually, I can get to the agents section. I'll go actually under agents here. And then I can go to agent push, which is the feature of TeamCity that lets me push the agent out to the server. So I'm going to go and select install agent, and I get to say what the host name is of the server I want installed on. In this case, it's going to be localhost because I happen to be on the same server. If you have an environment where you have TeamCity on one server and the agent on another, this would be whatever the agent server IP should be, or host name. And then you can actually set up presets if you find yourself doing this a lot. So in larger deployments, this is helpful if you have like hundreds of agents. But in this case, I'll just select to use custom settings. And then I only have the option right now for Unix, so I'll pick Unix, and that works for Linux as well. The default option for where to install it is fine, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be installing this to the TeamCity account that I created earlier, and this is where that password I set comes in handy. So I will use my TeamCity and my ABC123 set of credentials, and then what this will do is the home folder for TeamCity is /opt/TeamCity, so this should end up in /opt/TeamCity/build agent. Now click Install Agent. Cross your fingers, and if you have the right settings and you've set up the account correctly, this should work flawlessly. Every so often, you have to tweak something, but this is actually a live log, so it is keeping this up to date as it's happening. So it's connecting locally, and it's connecting over SSH, and it's uploading a Bootstrap installer, and then it's running it. And so far, so good. Perfect. This is exactly what we want to see. You will notice there is a warning that shows up. Let me make this a little bit bigger here. You'll get a warning during install that says, warning, the TeamCity agent installed as a standalone agent and will not start automatically on machine. Translation, if you restart the VM, TeamCity will not be running, at least the agent won't, which is why one of the things we'll do during this is we'll create a startup script for the agent so that your team is not wondering why builds aren't running. So that started that. So we have the agent, and by now we have Mercurial installed, at least for our purposes. And one of the things I'm going to do that's custom for Aegir that's very important is I need to set it up so that TeamCity can switch users and run things as the Aegir user. So it's going to basically run things through sudo, certain commands, because Aegir wants to run as the Aegir user whenever it's doing any site administration. So I'm going to add a set of options for the sudoers file, and I'll provide the options for this in the notes for this video. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file under sudoer, or under /etc/sudoers.d. I'm going to create a file here called TeamCity. You know, if you look in this folder at this point, you'll notice there's also another one that is called Aegir. Don't modify that one, because that one is just the sudoer configuration for Aegir, and the defaults are fine. But we're going to create one for the TeamCity user. And what we're going to put in here is a couple options. One is we're going to say we don't want to require a TTY for TeamCity to kick off things as Aegir. What that means is basically it can run without it being an actual user. It can run automatically. And then we're going to want to make sure always set home is set. On Ubuntu, for some reason, sudo does not switch the home, like the location of where the home folder is. If you switch from your user account to someone else's user account, the home folder that it thinks you have is the first user's home folder, not the home folder of the user you switch to, which is a little weird. It's just based on the way they built it. So we're going to make sure that always set home is set. And then the other thing is we want to make sure that TeamCity doesn't have to know a password to do this sudoing. When it runs commands through drush as Aegir, we don't want to require a password. It should just be able to run sudo -u Aegir and then the drush command and run automatically, because again, this is an automatic process. So that's what these three things do. We'll throw that in our sudoers file here, and that's all we need to do for that. And then the other thing I want to do is, I mentioned earlier that you might have a setup like we do where you have multiple build agents, and some of them can support Drupal builds with Aegir and some can't. The way that you handle that is there's actually a way in the build agent setup to specify like build agent properties. It's like basically like if you wanted to say this agent has a certain configuration, like certain hardware or certain software installed on it, you can like declare that in the properties for the build agent. So what I'll do is I'm switched over to the TeamCity user account, and I am going to where we installed the build agent. And this folder here, this where I am right now is I'm in opt TeamCity build agent. This was deployed for us through that agent push that I did a few minutes ago. So agent push created this whole structure for us, unpacked the agent, configured it for us, really took care of a lot of steps. And we're going to go into the build agent folder, and then we're going to go under the conf folder. And there's a file in here called buildagent.properties. I'm going to open that up. And in that file, you see that this is the stuff that the installer took care of for us. The agent push configured where our TeamCity server is located. I don't know why I needed to write it out 3 times, but you know, 3 times is the charm, I guess. So it set that all up for us, and then what we're able to do is at the bottom of this file is a section where it says you can declare extra properties. So what we're going to do here is we're going to actually declare a new property, and in our case we call it agent.aegir.version, and we just declare what version of Aegir we have. There's not really any specific significance to it, but it allows us, if we wanted to down the road, to require a build to run on only certain versions of Aegir. So maybe if we needed a different version of Aegir for Drupal 8 or something like that, we could say, okay, this particular project only runs on this configuration of Aegir. But I'm going to add agent.aegir.version equals 6x 2.1 to the build agent properties for this agent. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure there's no other settings I need for this agent. Yeah, I'm going to actually stop the agent that the agent push started for us because we wanted to pick up the settings that I just changed. So I'll go into the bin folder under this build agent, and I will say agent.sh stop, I believe. Yes, okay, and it sends a shutdown command to that running agent, and it'll stop in a few seconds. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the init script so that we can have this agent start and stop with the server. So sudo dash, actually I'll switch back to my account, and then I will write out an init script here in etc initd, and I'm going to call this TeamCity agent. And I can provide the contents for this. There's like a template in the documentation from TeamCity on what this file can look like. And there's only really 2 important things about it. One is you specify where the build agent actually is located on the server, and also what user you want the agent to run as. This needs to be the TeamCity user, because otherwise permissions are wrong, and no one wants that. So we'll do that, save that. I'm going to make it executable because it is a script. So we're going to make that 755. And on Ubuntu, I'm trying to remember the best way to add this to startup. It's one thing I should have grabbed in my notes before. Add init script to run level. It's one thing I do have to quickly Google. Should be like an upstart command I can add to add it. Yeah, it should be update RCD, I believe. Update RCD, and we'll call it TeamCity agent defaults. Let's see. Perfect. So what that did was it added the TeamCity agent to run during at the normal run levels for the system. In other words, start it up with the machine. Okay, so that will make it work on startup. But we also want to run it right now because we're ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll run the script that I just created. And I'll do TeamCity agent start. Perfect, that's what we want to see. So it just kicked off an agent in the background that's running. If I switch back to my TeamCity agent configuration, it takes a few seconds for the agent to start up and actually connect to the TeamCity server. There's a log that it creates. It actually prints that out on the console when it launches. I can watch the agent start up if I want to. So if I'm curious to know like what's going on, why is the agent not yet connecting, I can look here. And you'll notice that it'll do this thing towards the end of the log of build server agent registration, which tells us that it registered with the front end. So now if I go to agents, you see, I have my local host build agent, which is exactly what we want to see. And if I click on the agent in the TeamCity web interface, one of the things that I should see under agent parameters, configuration parameters, is this agent Aegir version. 6x2.1, which is exactly what we want, because that's the thing we specified, and that helps us distinguish what agents can handle drush and Aegir and which ones can. Okay, so that looks good. We started our agent, we're good to go there. Now, the agent is all set as far as we need it to be. Now I'm going to talk about how we actually set up builds in TeamCity so that we can get our Drupal build to work the way we want. We have what's referred to as a template in TeamCity. I don't know if Jenkins has a similar thing. I'm guessing it probably does. But TeamCity lets you basically create these reusable templates for your CI projects. And you can actually specify like variables that can be provided at the time that you're setting up a project with the template. The template then takes care of all of the annoying stuff you would normally have to provide every time you're setting up a CI project. And we have one of those templates we've created for Drupal CI. There's a lot in the template, so what I'll do is I'm just going to actually deploy this as an XML file to the server, and then I'll open it up in the web interface and I'll show you what it does. But for now, I'm just going to drop this in the web, or drop this into the agent or the TeamCity server configuration so that we can get going without having to configure a lot of options. In TeamCity 9, they actually added the ability to export these configurations and share them with people. But our current TeamCity server is actually TeamCity 8. The one I just installed is 9, but the one at RedBottle is 8. So that's why I kind of have to drop it in as a file instead of being able to export it from our server. But okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to being the TeamCity user. And you would be doing this on the TeamCity server, not the TeamCity agent, because it needs to be where the web interface is installed. So I'm going to switch over to the TeamCity user, and I'm going to go to where TeamCity itself is installed. So I'm in opt TeamCity, a little bit redundant, I know. And then, actually no, sorry. I actually need to go where it set up the settings for the build server, which is actually in /opt/TeamCity/dot build server. There's actually this whole structure where this is where like the local database is, and where like configuration that was generated during that first run wizard, this is where that all lives. If I wanted to completely blow that all away and have TeamCity set itself up again, I'd blow away this .build server folder. So that's why it's really helpful that TeamCity is running under its own user account, not under me, not under root. It has its own stuff, you know, separate from all that stuff. So I'm going to go into the config folder here, and there's a projects folder here, so I'll go there. And then TeamCity by default has this root project. Every project in TeamCity extends from the root project. So you can put things in that root project that you want your other projects to inherit. So in our case, we want to create this Drupal CI template that we can inherit in other projects. So I'm going to go into the root project. So I am in /opt/TeamCity/.build server/config/project/_root. And in here, right now, there's just this plugin data and this project-config.xml. I can create another folder in there. Let's see, this is under build types. Okay, I'm going to create a folder called build types, lowercase b, uppercase t. And then in there, I'm going to create my file. Now, you don't have to do it this way if you're creating a template. I just happen to have one already that I'm importing. You would normally do this through the web interface if you're creating a template for the first time. But I'll show you where those settings are in a second. Okay, and I just want to make sure that that looks correct in Nano. Perfect. Yeah, that all looks good. Okay, now I'm going to switch back to the web interface, and I'm going to go to the root project. And let's see. There it is, perfect. Okay, so TeamCity actually is intelligent. If you do what I just did, if you do happen to have an XML file that someone hands you with this template and you drop it in that location, TeamCity actually watches the folder. So it detected that I had put my Drupal CI template and it made it available now in the web UI. But I had mentioned I was going to show you where these settings are and how you'd create this by default from the web. If you wanted to create this template from scratch, you'd click Create Template, and you'd fill out the step-by-step wizard to create it. In our case, we already have it. I just imported it. It's called my Drupal CI template. And what this does for us is it's basically like the set of steps that need to happen for TeamCity to kick off builds through Aegir to build our Drupal sites. And there's a lot of configuration options we've already set up in here. I can share this template with you guys because it takes care of a lot of the stuff, and it's already general purpose. So it's not tied to anything that we do special here. It's just we came up with a process and made it general purpose. So there's a setting here that tells it like where the artifacts live. This setting actually tells TeamCity like when you're done with the build, here's where you go look for it, and here's what you package up so that we can like save that build for reference for later. So that's what the artifact paths do. TeamCity has this really helpful option where anytime you want to know what an option does, you can click on this little help icon and it'll bring up exactly the documentation on that. So if you do happen to be poking around in here and you're wondering what these things do, their documentation is actually pretty good. The other thing I wanted to cover while I'm in here is the build steps. Very, very important. This is the stuff that I'm actually going to cover in a decent amount of detail because this is the stuff that actually interacts with DRush and with Aegir. So what we did was we have our build broken into 4 steps. Actually, you can add more steps to this as you need. In our development environment, we actually have a 5th step that compiles Sass. So we do a lot of stuff with Sass, CSS compiler, and Compass, if you're familiar with it. You can actually add those steps to this process and have it compile the Sass for you. And in our case, in our build, we have like the very first step is it looks to see if there's any Sass themes in our project. And if there are, it actually compiles the Sass first and then does the Drupal install. So if we broke anything in our Sass, it'll tell us. But for your purposes, just getting this working with Drupal, I've removed the Sass stuff and any superfluous stuff, but I wanted to mention you can add extra build steps to this template. The four steps that we identified that are important for just installing stuff through Drupal and Aegir is 1, assemble the installation profile platform and register it with Aegir. What does that mean? That means basically that makefile that I showed you earlier, following it, downloading all the stuff from Drupal.org that makes up the rest of the profile, getting it all set up so it's literally an installation profile that's ready to be installed, and then telling Aegir that it's available for use to install sites. So that's just a matter of getting all the files together and telling Aegir, hey, you have files here that you can use for sites. Step 2, install a new site on platform with Aegir. That's the part where we go from it just being a collection of files to actually having a database and a functioning Drupal site on top of those files. Then these other 2 steps, import new site into Aegir frontend and set up first time login link in Aegir frontend for convenience, are really more for developers to be happy. The import new site into Aegir frontend actually registers the Drupal site that this installs with that Aegir frontend that I logged in earlier. This allows us then to manage our build like any other site that we install through Aegir. Without that step, you have a Drupal site that runs and you can log into it and all that stuff, but it won't show up in Hostmaster, the front end for Aegir. So that's what that step does. And then the first time login link, it literally just kicks off a reset password through Aegir so that I can, and I'll show you this, I can actually log into the new site through Hostmaster and it'll log me in for the first time. So that's how that works. So that's the steps. And then if you dig into this, these are actually bash scripts. We happen to have them embedded in our template. There's another way to do this. You could technically check these into source control, and then your TeamCity template, you can actually register version control paths in the template. So you could technically check out your build configuration scripts as part of the build and then run them that way. We just happen to have them as part of the template, but we might move them to source control at some point. But anyway, these are bash scripts, and they do exactly what I said they do. So the assemble installation profile platform, what this does is it uses sudo to switch over to the Aegir user and run these drush commands, and basically this will create the platform from the makefiles. And I'm not going to cover every single line of these scripts because that would just take forever. But what I do want to point out is that some of these steps for DRush, there is an option that DRush and Hostmaster, or rather the Aegir provisioning system. I think it's called provision. It's literally called provision.
Yep.
There are options provision supports that force the task to be done immediately. Normally, if you use provision through DRush to set up a Drupal site and set up a platform and all that stuff, it queues it up. It puts it in a queue that Aegir runs periodically, and you might wait up to a minute or 5 minutes, whatever your cron setting is, for that task to execute. The problem with that is that we're doing a CI job. We want this build to run now. We need it to run now. We need to know whether this will work or not. And we can't be waiting around for a queue to execute. Plus, we already know that this is running as the Aegir user, so we don't have to worry about that task queue coming around. Normally, with Hostmaster, when you're doing stuff through the front end, it gets queued up, but the reason is because this Hostmaster front end is running as Apache. And all of the tasks, all of the things that Aegir does need to run as the Aegir user. So that's why they have it queue up. The front end queues it up, the back end runs it as the Aegir user and actually gets it done. But for our CI jobs, we're running as the Aegir user. We're the right user. We have all the permissions we need. We have everything we need. We just need it to run immediately. That's where this -- force option comes in handy. This forces provision to run the task right now as part of this script, and it'll hold up, it'll block until it's done, which is great because we can capture output from the build in the log for the CI job, and if something's wrong with that install, it'll fail the build, which is exactly what we want it to do because it'll tell us something's wrong with our build. So that's the only thing I really wanted to point out here in this code is this -- force option, which causes it to run the hosting task immediately instead of queue it up. And let's see, is there anything else I need to point out? Not really. The way we've written these scripts, they use a lot of variables. I'll show you where these show up, but they're dynamic. So we don't actually have to touch these scripts. I wrote these maybe 8 or 9 months ago. I haven't had to touch them at all since then. But the variables in here actually show up under a section called parameters. So this is our template, our Drupal CI template, as I mentioned earlier. And some of these things we provide values for, and other things we purposely leave this value called unset in here. There's no significance to that. TeamCity doesn't have like unset as some special keyword. It's just a hint to us when we're setting up the build that that's something that we need to fill in. And I'll show you what that does in a second. But these other things are like the default values. So if we, for example, needed to break convention for a particular project and name something differently, we could do that. Most of these, though, are fine the way they are. I'm going to tweak the site email address. I'll make it my own email address. Actually, you know what? I'll make it unset. That's what I'll do. Make it unset, and I'll show you where that shows up. And I'm also going to tweak this root domain setting. I borrowed this from our actual internal server that we use, our CI server that RedBottle uses. For this one that we just set up, it needs to be Aegir demo 2. So I'll save that. This is just the root domain of the sites. And this needs to match, for our scripts, this needs to match what you set up in DNS for that wildcard, the part after the wildcard. Everything else in here should be fine. We have a standard format for a lot of this stuff, and it should be great the way it is. Okay, so I'm all set with my template. My template's imported. Now let's actually do the fun part. Let's actually set up a build. Part everyone's probably been waiting for in this 2-hour-long video here. I'm going to go under administration, and I'm going to create a project. And I'm going to call this sample because I'm terribly unoriginal right now. The project I just created is the top-level project. A project can have multiple things in it. It just so happens that for Drupal projects, you have within that project your actual installation profile, the build configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and create a build configuration under this project that I just added. And this is where I get to use the template I just configured. So I'm going to call this installation profile. And TeamCity says, okay, we're going to call this the sample installation profile. And I get to pick, based on template, Drupal CI. So I'm going to pick Drupal CI. And what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, you need to fill out all of these variables. This is where the stuff I said would show up. This is where it shows up. Internal name is whatever you want to call the project internally. It's like a code name or whatever is of significance to your team, because this is what shows up in the URL at the top. I'll show you what I mean in a second. I'm going to just call this sample. Install profile, this needs to be the name, the internal machine name of the install profile. The one I was covering earlier is called sample, so sample. Most of the time, internal name and install profile name are the same, unless you want to really confuse your team. Makefile, I'm going to leave it alone. This is actually using variables, so it usually picks up the right name just based on the other two variables I just filled out. Platform prefix, same thing, that's fine. Version core, this is a 7x project, I'm going to leave that alone. Site email. This is the email address that you want to receive emails every time there's a new build. So basically either pick a team account or pick a developer that you want to annoy the hell out of and use that email address. Most of my team uses my email address, so I usually get notified every time there's a build.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's my team right there. So I'll go ahead and create this, and bam, I have the build configuration all set up, and it actually is linked to that Drupal CI template. The nice thing about that is if I need to tweak the way that we do our CI jobs for Drupal, I can edit that one template, and all of the jobs, all of the build configurations based on that template get updated. But I can also override some of those settings here in my build configuration if I need to. Okay. There's only one other thing I need to do in order for this to actually work. And you probably already know what I'm about to say. I need to actually make this build configuration check out stuff from source control, because where is the code going to come from? So I'm going to go under version control settings under my installation profile. I'm going to attach a VCS root, version control system root, and I have the URL here. Let's see. Yep, I'm going to grab my URL here. Our source control server is named Hermes. And we have an account. And this is going to be totally dependent on how you have version control set up in your organization. If you use Bitbucket or anything like that, you will need the credentials to access the repo. In our case, we have a local road code server for Git and Mercurial. And I've created a system build account on that server that we can grant read-only access to specific repos. So we're basically able to say on a per repo basis which repos the build agent has, or the build server has access to, by just granting the system build account access to that stuff. So I'll just grab the password here for system build and create this. This will actually attempt to connect to your source control system with the credentials you provided, and it'll tell you if it's wrong. And it'll even try and figure out which source control it is. So most of the time it's intelligent enough to figure that out for Mercurial. And if I've configured this correctly, I shouldn't have to enter anything else. It should just work and come back and say, you're all set. So let's hope. Unfortunately, our source control server is a little bit slow, so I'm not actually concerned that this is taking a few minutes. Now, we happen to be using a username and password. There is a way to use like key-based authentication. I know like Bitbucket for the longest time I think only supported key-based authentication for Git. And I think recently they enabled you to use a username and password. There is a way under advanced options to provide a key instead for access. But the VCS route I'm setting up is part of this particular project. You can specify the VCS routes as part of the template at the top level in that root project like I was mentioning earlier. What we actually do a lot of times is common features or common modules we use in every Drupal project. We actually add those to our Drupal CI template, and we can provide rules in that template to say how we want them checked out. So that structure that I was mentioning earlier in the installation profile of like modules, custom, and modules features, we can actually leverage that in our template to say, hey, go check out this common feature in that folder. And as part of the build, it'll do that. So there we go. Oh, Perfect. So Mercurial, it figured it out. It got it all set up. It validated my credentials. It should be all set. The other thing I wanted to point out while I'm in here, there's this agent requirements section. This is showing exactly what we want to see. The template, that Drupal CI template that I imported, we have a stipulation in there that says the only agents we can run this on are those that have that Aegir version 6x 2.1 property. So what this is showing is that this build I created under my sample installation profile is going to run on the agent that we expected it to. If I didn't have that set up correctly on my build agent, then this local host agent would be under incompatible agents. This allows you to verify that you won't accidentally try and run a Drupal build on a non-Drupal server. So if you have Windows agents, they should show up under incompatible agents, and they just aren't eligible. It'll wait until you have a build agent that's able to run your build. But this is what we want to see. So perfect. Good. All right. So in theory, we should be good to go, and we should be able to run a build. It's the moment we've all been waiting for, I'm sure. So I am going to go under projects. I'm back into the non-admin area. So I just clicked on projects up here, and I'm back out. And here's my sample project. Here's my installation profile build configuration. I'm going to pull that up. And what it's going to tell me is there's not a lot to tell me yet because I haven't run any builds. There's no history, all that stuff. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to kick off a build. And what you'll see is now all the agents we have in the pool, all one of them, are now busy. And it'll tell me here's the status of the build that's running. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll click on that build. And I can actually watch the build in real time. Oh, close to real time. It'll allow me to watch the build log. And the build log is actually organized around those steps that I covered earlier. So it groups them together by step 1, step 2, step 3, so you can actually see where it is in the process. If you set this view to verbose, it'll even show you as it's checking out from source control, what it's doing, it's creating a patch, all that fun stuff. This is the first time that we are building this particular installation profile. So this checkout is a little bit longer than others because there's nothing already checked out on the build agent. So it's going to create this mega patch that has all of the profile from source control in it. And it even explains, it's doing a clean checkout. And it says, here's the reason why. Agent doesn't have any version of the project sources. Checkout directory is empty. So it'll actually explain to you, if you're ever trying to figure out why are you doing a clean checkout? Why is it taking so long? The log will try and explain to you what the rationale behind it was. So that's a nice thing. Okay, so repository sources transferred. So that's what you want to see. That means it transferred the code over. This is running Aegir right now. It's actually running it through DRush, and you can see it downloading Drupal 7.3.5. I can probably make this a little bit bigger. It's downloading all of the different modules that were stipulated in our DRush makefile, and it should be set with step 1. Now we're on step 2. Okay. You will see a couple of, oh, it failed. Lovely. I will find out why. You will see a couple of errors in the log in every build that have these error 1045 access denied for user intentionally invalid. That's actually Drupal testing database access, so it's supposed to fail. Those errors are actually expected errors. But let's see what the reason was for why this build actually failed just now. Okay. I must have a typo because it says the profile you have chosen cannot be loaded. Not CUI. Knew there had to be something during this demo that would have to break because it was going too well. Let's see if we had any errors downloading anything. Okay, so we downloaded Drupal. I know why it's not working. I forgot to install drush make local. I mentioned I was going to install that earlier and I didn't. Let's take care of that right now. So drush make local, you need to make sure you install it on the agent because that is where Aegir runs, that is where drush runs. And so that's where it needs to be. And specifically, you'll want to install it. I probably skipped it in my, yeah, I did. That's where I want to do it. You'll want to put it in user share drush commands. So I'm going to switch over to being root for the moment. And I'm going to cd into /user/share/drush/commands. And you might be asking me why. Why do you want it in that folder? The reason is because I want this drush make local to be available to all users on this system, not just the Aegir user, because we do have developers log in from time to time to run these builds manually to see if they can troubleshoot a build failure. If you go there, you'll see the only thing that's there right now is provision, which is something Aegir installed. That's the backend that Aegir uses to set up sites. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a git clone of the make local project here. There is a project page for make local. If you go to on Drupal.org, there is a make local project. Don't use that version because they moved development from there to GitHub. I don't know why. They could have just as easily kept it on Drupal.org, but for some reason they moved it to GitHub. And the one that's on GitHub works with the latest version of drush. If you don't use that version, you'll get some really strange errors during build. All right. I'm also going to change ownership of the thing I just downloaded to make sure that it is owned by Aegir, I believe. No, I don't need to. It needs to be run. It needs to be owned as root because I installed it for everyone. Let me just make sure that the permissions allow everyone to access it. Let's see. Yep, good. Okay, so that should be all set. Let's try this build again. Let me just make sure I had an error here about profile. One of the ways you know you're missing drush make local, by the way, if you're following our convention, is that the step 1 will be very short. Because all it did was run that top level makefile, downloaded Drupal, and then went, cool, that's all I got. That's all I got to do. And it didn't build the profile like we wanted it to. So now what I'll do is I'm going to run this build again. And all we need to do that is I'll scroll back up to the top and I click this run button and I'm done. It'll actually kick off a new build and there it goes. So build 2 is kicking off, and you'll notice that the part that does the VCS checkout is a lot faster because there's no new code to really send down. It'll check and see that Mercurial says the latest version we have is the same version we had, so it should skip past that pretty quickly and it'll jump right into step 1. Done with repository sources transfer. Okay, so now it's doing the step 1 again. And with luck, this will take longer because then it's actually doing what we want. Well, let's see. Did it? Nope, still failed. Let's see why. Let's see. So we've got our patches to Drupal core. Let me see. Let me see if make local shows up. And if it doesn't, then I might have something I need to tweak about the way I installed it. One of the things we can do to troubleshoot this is I can actually go to where TeamCity set up this work folder, they call it. So at the very start of your build, you'll see that it says where it's starting the build agent, and it actually tells you, it'll actually tell you that it's starting in a certain folder under build agent work. That is, it's in existence for a little while and kind of gives you a chance to do like a post-mortem on your build if you really want to poke around with what it checked out. So I'm going to head over there and see what I got here. And predictably, this is what I showed you earlier in my IDE. So this is actually the structure of the installation profile that we were poking around in earlier. This is what it checked out. And I should be able to do a drush make in here of my build sample make. And I can tell it I want it to put it in some folder. So I want to build an entire installation profile in some folder. So I'll just tell it, put it up one level over in a folder called test. Okay, so I got that. Actually, let me try putting it in a local folder called test. Okay. So there's definitely something up with drush make local because I should see in here all of the different modules getting downloaded and installed, and I'm not. So it doesn't look like it's seeing my other make file. So let me just double check that I put drush make local in the right place and that it has the right settings. Let's see.
Says not writable.
Yeah, that's okay, because that step, when it moves it into place, it does that at the end, and I'm expecting that would fail, but because it'll be like, what happens during drush make is it'll actually create a temp folder and do all the work in the temp folder, and then when it's done, it moves it into the right spot. So I should see all that happen, and then it'll complain that it can't write when it's done.
Yeah.
But let me just switch over to being root here. User share drush. No, I had it in user share drush commands. There's probably something really silly with the way that I set this up. Let's see. Well, it looks correct. Access looks correct too. Let me see if there's a quick way we can find out what plugins are installed. Yeah. Interesting. Let me just double check our make file here. Build sample make. Download source local. I can also do drush. I'm gonna do drush make with verbose on and see what it says. Let me try one more thing. I'll do drush dl make local. Okay, so this is what I originally did. This is what, like, I didn't think that this step would help, but we'll try it. If you do drush dl make local, it'll try and download the version of drush make local that's on Drupal.org. In every other installation I've done of this, I did that first and then realized I needed to get the one from Git. It might be the case that drush keeps track of what modules it's installed to enable them for drush. So I'm going to try that. If that works, that's an interesting workaround. But let's see. Yeah, that's what. There must be a config file for drush that tells it to look for it, because the version that I downloaded from Git is the correct version. Okay, I can stop this now. So that tells me. So there's got to be. I got to look into that, and I can probably provide a comment on the video. There's probably some configuration file for drush that tells it to go look for this, but the version that's in the user share commands drush make local, that one supersedes whatever is in the home folder for drush. So, all right, so let's go ahead and let's rerun our build here and see what we get. Okay. let's see what happens at step 1. That's what we want to see, sample found. Cool. All right, so now this step 1 is taking longer because it's actually going to Drupal.org and downloading all of the modules we want to have in our profile. And that's the part that actually builds the installation profile. Without that happening, what was happening in step 2, the failure we were seeing, is that there was no installation profile ready for Drupal to install. So Aegir goes to install a site on something that doesn't exist, and of course, that causes problems. So it was all, the issue we were seeing before was just make local wasn't registering with drush, so when it downloaded the makefile and the makefile said go look over here for the installation profile recipe, wasn't there. So looks like it's going now. Let's see what we got. And what this will do is it'll periodically update the log with the output from the build so far. So I'm just going to scroll back here. It'll pause at different points. Now what tends to happen is the output from drush gets buffered by the agent. So it might be, you'll see like a whole bunch of lines all of a sudden go by because the agent's buffering the output. I'm not sure exactly where the cutoff is, but they try to avoid the agent not causing too much overhead, constantly like hitting the server with line after line after line of output. But yeah, you'll see, so the nice thing, this is what I was mentioning earlier, all those patches we have in our makefile, this is where they get applied. They get applied in step 1, and it'll actually tell you if like a patch fails, it'll fail the build. So if you have patches applied and then a module gets updated after the fact, and that update already includes the patch or makes it incompatible, your build will fail. If you upgrade your module and find the patch is incompatible, this is where you'll find that out. So it's kind of nifty.
I think this is why Drupal.org has 3 terabytes of throughput every month.
Yep. I'm surprised it's only 3 terabytes.
Well, maybe it's more.
Yeah, for people like us constantly hitting it up with module downloads. There is a nice feature of drush that you might not recognize or realize is there. It actually does cache the downloads. So this is the first time that it's downloaded a lot of these modules, which is why it's taking so long. But drush actually keeps a local cache of modules on the server. So if the version you're asking for happens to already be there, it won't download it again. All right, so now we are into the actual Drupal site install. And we can see invoking site pre-install. You'll see a lot of the watchdog messages you're probably familiar with seeing. If you ever looked at the watchdog, like right after Drupal install, you'll see all the installs for all the different modules. They're getting installed in dependency order. There's like a tree of dependencies it's walking to get everything installed in the order it needs to be for all the modules and features and things like that. So that's getting all installed. And then of course our install profile has some extra watchdog output to tell us when it's at certain points. So it's doing all that. And for us, now one of the things I hadn't mentioned earlier, but I just wanted to quickly bring it up here. You might be asking, if we're doing a build every time and we're not taking the same database from build to build, how do we deal with content? Because inevitably you'll have some content, either it's pages or some kind of information. It could be on an e-commerce site. You might have an initial catalog of products you're launching with. How do you deal with that? We're using the migrate module for that. And if you've been following Drupal 8, migrate's actually one of the preferred ways to get content into Drupal 8. If you have a Drupal 7 site you're upgrading, migrate's also the module that Commerce Guys uses for their demo sites. If you're installing Commerce Kickstart, migrate's the module that they use to import all the content from CSV files. We do the same thing here. You don't have to use migrate. There are other modules you could use to import content. Please, for the love of God, do not use features to import content. It is not intended for that. You can do it. People have written modules that will do it, but inevitably you will revert something that your customer has put in production, and it'll cause a whole bunch of badness. So don't use features for content. But migrate is nice because migrate will allow you to pull it in either from another database or CSV files or any type of data source. There's like 5 or 6 different kinds of data sources you can use. In our case, we usually just package it as CSV files with the feature that needs that content. So if we have, like, for example, some taxonomies that need to go with something for drop downs or things like that, we'll package CSV files with the feature that creates those fields to populate the taxonomy. Or we'll have a module under that content folder that I said I'd mention briefly. We have this modules content. We sometimes create modules that just declare migrations with migrate to pull in that content, like sample content. Like if it's for demoing for the customer, if you wanted to throw in some sample content to give them a sense of like what an e-commerce store can handle, you could set up your content migrations in there. And then what will happen is, as part of our installation profile, our installer looks for, sort of happened towards the end of the install, our installer looks for content migrations. So you'll see, like, there was this log line that said installation profile will perform X number of content import migrations. The installer will actually look for those modules that are enabled that have migrations defined and run them as part of the install, so that when this build is done, our database already has content. So that's how we handle that. And that's why we don't really care about the database at all from build to build. All right, so our build succeeded, and we're all set. And I wanted to point out before I log in, because I want to keep the audience in anticipation, there is a tab under the build called Artifacts. This is where you get to see the files that got produced from the build. And the configuration that we use actually zips them up because it's faster to do that. If you zip it up, then it actually just sends one zip file up to the TeamCity server. If you don't have it do a zip, it'll actually send every file up, and it takes much longer for builds to finish. So we switched over to zip files a while ago. This zip file has all the files, and if you look at them, you'll recognize this is a Drupal install. So all of the Drupal files are here. And then if I go under Profiles, Sample, you'll recognize this is the format, or the structure that I showed you earlier. But now we have Contrib. And Contrib has all the stuff that DRush downloaded for us. And we also have our sample develop feature, which we had from earlier, and everything else is pretty much the same. But we have this Contrib folder now, which we didn't have before. And this is all inside this profiles folder, and then we have a whole Drupal install all around it. There's also a sites folder. Excuse me. We have a sites folder, and this is the sites folder for this build that just ran. If we were curious to see what went in there, you usually don't need it in the archive, but it's captured here just if you wanted to take a look at what the settings file was and DRush-RC and all that stuff. You can also download the zip file, and that gives you your entire profile. When we go to run a build out to production for a customer, like if we're deploying a site, we actually use this, download the zip, drop that in production, run the normal Drupal installer, and we pick our profile, and that is how we deploy the site for the first time to production. We just allow the CI environment to do the whole build. The other thing that's nice with that is if you already have a site out in production and you need to upgrade it, like you've created a new version, because everything that makes up the site structure is in the profile and not scattered amongst like your sites folder or sites all or part of the actual like Drupal platform, you can actually just replace the profile on the production site with the new version of the profile and then run the database upgrades. And assuming, of course, that your modules do their schema migrations correctly, you can actually upgrade the production site. Obviously, we do it in staging first, and then if it works, we roll it out to production. But my point is just if you use installation profiles and you do it this way, your maintenance is actually easier because you can just replace the platform with a new version and upgrade everything. Okay. Now the moment you've probably been waiting for, what does the site look like now that we did this build, and how do we get to it? Well, if I go back to my Hostmaster front end, you'll notice I have a build that just finished. There's actually a task in the task queue that finished for the login reset. And if I click on that, it takes me to the page for build3.ci.sample.agerdemo2.redbottledesign.com. I know that's a mouthful. In our case, where it says Aegir Demo 2, ours is like a 3-letter thing, HAL or whatever. But anyway, the way this works is this TeamCity automatically generated the host name for us. It based it off the build number. It based it off the name of the project, the internal name. And I can click on this login link and log in to the site that I just built. And our dev module actually even named the site based on what build number it is so that we know we're on build 3. And if I look in the modules page, or go to the modules page, I can see all the modules I expect to see in here. These are all the ones that we had to download as part of our profile. There are some that are already enabled, some third-party ones. The most obvious one being that we have the module filter. And of course, some of the modules in my installation profile apparently need updates. So, yeah, I have a couple updates to install. So, we just installed Drupal through CI. And I can poke around with this install and do what I want. I can create features and export them. I can also do those updates that it's bitching at me right now to do. If I want, what I'll do is I'll pull up my make file here. I will pull up, let's see, we need to do entity API. We want to try 1.6 on that, and CTools 1.7 and features 2.4. Let's try all those right now. Because that way, I get to show you the actual CI part of CI, the part that gets invoked when you make changes. So we'll do entity, yep, right here, entity API. We want to make that 1.6, 7x 1.6. We're going to make CTools. Make that 1.7. We're going to make features 2.4. It is important still, even with this process, to read the release notes, because occasionally there's gotchas, like don't use this with this other version, or this module gets renamed, things like that. So do pay attention to those. But and we'll make module filter version 2 that got released, cool. And we'll make rules 2.9, and we'll make token 1.6. Okay. All right, so I'll just run with that. Commit and push. Okay, so now let me go back to TeamCity, and I'm going to just sit here and actually wait and see. This should pick up the build that I just pushed, or the changes that I just pushed up to the source control server. And I'm actually just going to double check that those really did get pushed. Every so often my IntelliJ setup does not always push stuff up to the server. It says it does, and then it didn't really, but pushed 0 commits. I don't know if I believe you, because you said 0, and it should be definitely more than 0. So we'll see. Source tree is my go-to if I want to just work with source control locally instead of using IntelliJ. But there's many different good source control clients out there. Okay, so we'll give this a second. There is a polling interval you can adjust. That's basically sets how often it checks source control for new changes. As you get more projects, you'll want to adjust that, because if you leave it on the default, then your source control server can get really bogged down getting pulled. And I think there's a way, actually there is a way you can have TeamCity not pull for that. There's a way to have it like get notified on check-in with a hook. But we usually just have it pull. I can also tell it to check for pending changes if I'm impatient and I want to like jump ahead. There it is, cool, pending changes, one change. What's the change? The change is apply module updates. And I can actually ask TeamCity to show me the diff while I'm here. And it says, oh, this one file changed. And then it'll grab it and give me a diff momentarily. This is running on a VM with about 512 megs of RAM allocated to it, so this will take a second or so. There's the diff. So that's the change that we expect to see, and it should be kicking off a build right now. Let's see. Yep, we're on step 1 of 4. And I can actually watch it here if I wanted to. It tries to estimate how long the build will take based on average runtime of the build. It actually will also keep track of statistics. So if you wanted to know, like, is this build taking longer than usual or whatnot, and what's my trend, I can show you that in a second. But we saw this before. This is the build that's running. It's going out and it's grabbing all the modules again. A lot of this should be faster because it's cached. So it'll just grab it from the local cache. Every so often, if you're pulling down a new version, like if you're pulling down a version of a module that literally just got released, I had this happen with views once, you'll have to clear the cache because sometimes it thinks the module version's not available because Drupal.org hasn't packaged it yet. So every so often you have to go clear DRush's cache, but I've only had that happen maybe once in 4 months, 5 months. It doesn't happen that often. And after this, I'll be all set. I don't want to. I know we have a certain amount of video we can record here, so don't want to run over. But we've covered a lot, so. Yeah, in our settings for the build, we actually have it tell DRush to use verbose and debug output, so we get every little step of everything in the output. You can technically tweak it so it doesn't give you as much, but when the build fails, then it's a little bit more of a pain to figure out why. So we just set it on debug and verbose. Okay, and this is where it's creating the zip file, and it's done. Okay, so build's finished. It was successful. If I go back to Hostmaster, I should see that if I refresh the page here, there's my build 4. I can click on that, and I can click on log into build 4. There's my build 4. And if I go to reports now and go to available updates, I should not have any available updates. So it looks like my updates were successful and didn't break the installation. And I still have the previous build. If I wanted to poke around with it for whatever reason, I can go back to it. It's still there too. They're both there. Build 3, build 4. So what our process tends to be is when we're developing features, we will pick a build that we want to start the feature on, like create the feature on. Kind of use that as like our playground. We might test out a couple modules or things like that for the feature. And then when we get it the way we want, we'll export it through features. We'll use the features interface to create the feature. We'll add it to our installation profile in that area I showed you earlier. Check it in, see if it builds, load up the new build, see if the feature deployed the right way, see if everything's working the way we want it to work. And if it is, we're good. So that is how to set up continuous integration with TeamCity, Aegir, Drupal, and, well, in this case, Mercurial. But you could use any kind of source control that TeamCity supports. So. Any questions? All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Bravo.